The Great Silence was not just Sergio Corbucci's most nihilistic film. It was a million-dollar crisis that nearly destroyed his career and was actively banned across half of Europe. We are digging into the wreckage of The Great Silence, with 20 secrets the studio tried to bury, uncovering the hidden history of a winter-bound masterpiece that Hollywood did not want you to see. The screenplay was penned by Sergio Donati, a prolific Italian writer who had worked uncredited on several Sergio Leone masterpieces, alongside Vittoriano Petrilli. Their original working title for the project was The Mute of Snow Creek, a direct reference to the protagonist's brutally scarred throat and his inability to speak. The script was a calculated, violent subversion of the spaghetti western formula, replacing the sun-baked deserts of Almeria with a crushing, isolated blizzard in the mountains of Utah. When Donati and Corbucci presented the draft to the producers at Fida Cinematographica, the reception was violently dismissive. The head of the studio did not just pass on the script, he threw it across the room, deriding it as a frozen, suicidal waste of celluloid that actively spat in the face of paying audiences. The insulting reason for its initial rejection was rooted in pure commercial cowardice. The executives argued that the European working class, who flocked to westerns for escapist violence and catharsis, would absolutely refuse to sit in a theater for 2 hours shivering alongside destitute outlaws. They viewed the snow not as an artistic choice, but as a punitive cinematic experience, mocking Corbucci for thinking audiences wanted to watch characters freeze to death rather than engage in thrilling gunfights. But director Sergio Corbucci was not in a position to walk away from this fight. By late 1967, Corbucci found himself tethered to a career anchor that was rapidly dragging him under. He was trapped in a suffocating contractual obligation with Fida Cinematographica, a production company with well-documented, deeply entrenched ties to the Roman underworld. These were not legitimate Hollywood financiers. They were men who demanded returns on their investments and possessed the means to enforce those demands through physical intimidation. Corbucci had scored a massive hit with Django, but the subsequent films he owed the mob-backed studio had underperformed, placing him in a perilous financial and physical position. The Great Silence was framed as a survive-or-die moment for the director. If he delivered another standard, forgettable Western, he would be permanently relegated to the B-movie scrap heap, relegated to directing exploitative quickies until his contract expired or his spirit broke. But if he walked away, the consequences with his financiers would be severe. Corbucci needed this film to be an artistic triumph that transcended the genre, effectively elevating his status so high that the mobsters could not touch him. He viewed the bleakness of The Great Silence not as a risk, but as a necessary armor, a film so ideologically charged and stylistically revolutionary that it would force the international critical establishment to take him seriously as an auteur rather than just a Leone imitator. This is exactly why the origins of the narrative itself remain so deeply contested. When examining the cinema genealogy of The Great Silence, the official credits tell a fraction of the story. Corbucci was notoriously unapologetic about borrowing from other filmmakers, but the DNA of this specific film traces back to an uncredited inspiration that nearly resulted in a massive plagiarism lawsuit. The core concept of a mute, scarred protagonist wielding a Mauser C96 pistol in a hostile, snowbound environment was lifted almost entirely from the visual framework of an obscure, out-of-print French graphic novel series that had circulated in Italy in the early 60s. The creator of that comic, a Belgian artist, recognized his character designs and narrative beats in the promotional stills for Corbucci's film and initiated a quiet but aggressive legal campaign through Italian lawyers. To avoid a scandal that would have halted the film's release, Fida Cinematographica orchestrated a hush settlement out of court, paying the artist a pittance in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. Consequently, the visual plagiarism was buried, and Corbucci successfully absorbed a foreign aesthetic into the spaghetti western mythos, passing it off as his own original nihilism. But the real problem was getting anyone to actually play the lead. The sliding doors of casting for The Great Silence are littered with scandalous and insulting rejections. Corbucci's first choice for the mute gunslinger Silence was Clint Eastwood, who was transitioning from Italian cinema to American superstardom. When the script was sent to Eastwood's agents at Malpaso Productions, the rejection was swift and profoundly insulting. Eastwood's team sent a formal letter back to the Italian producers, explicitly mocking the downbeat ending, where the hero is brutally gunned down and the villains win. The letter reportedly stated that participating in a film where the protagonist is executed in cold blood was commercial suicide, labeling the script a moronic exercise in audience punishment that would permanently damage Eastwood's growing brand. Franco Nero, the original Django, was also approached, but he arrogantly refused to shave his prominent mustache for the role, leading to a bitter falling out with Corbucci. This cascade of insulting rejections forced Corbucci into a corner, leading him to cast Jean-Louis Trintignant, a French dramatic actor who had never fired a gun on screen. Trintignant's casting was viewed by the Italian crew as a bizarre, artsy mistake, a deliberate snub to the macho expectations of the genre. However, what the dismissive crew failed to anticipate was Trintignant's terrifying commitment to the psychological decay of the character. To prepare for the role of a man whose throat was slit as a child, leaving him permanently mute, Trintignant engaged in a form of method acting that bordered on self-harm. He refused to speak on set for weeks leading up to production, communicating only through written notes. More disturbingly, he began wearing medical adhesive tape over his mouth during his off hours, sitting alone in his hotel room in the freezing Dolomite Mountains to simulate the claustrophobia and isolation of his character. This extreme immersion caused Trintignant to suffer actual panic attacks, a detail completely absent from the promotional material but documented in the unpublished diaries of a production assistant. The actor was actively inducing a state of psychological distress, blurring the line between performance and genuine trauma. When the cameras finally rolled, his eyes carried a profound, unsettling emptiness that no seasoned Western actor could have faked. He was not playing a stoic gunslinger. He was projecting the hollowed-out shell of a trauma victim, fundamentally altering the masculine posture of the Western hero from confident to deeply vulnerable. Now, casting the villainous bounty killer Loco required an actor who could embody predatory capitalism and unapologetic sadism. Klaus Kinski was brought in, and his presence immediately turned the set into a war zone. The production chaos caused by Kinski was not the standard diva behavior of a difficult actor. It was a sustained campaign of psychological terror that resulted in formal, documented union grievances. According to a complaint filed with the Italian Filmworkers Union, the Sindacato Nazionale Lavoratori dello Spettacolo, Kinski repeatedly physically assaulted a prop master named Giulio during a scene setup. Kinski, enraged by a minor delay, grabbed a heavy, metal, reinforced prop rifle and repeatedly rammed it into the chest of the crew member, bruising his ribs and causing a localized panic. The union grievance, which was buried by Fida Cinematographica to avoid production delays, detailed how Kinski had to be physically restrained by 3 crew members to prevent him from bludgeoning the man to death. Rather than fire Kinski, which the mob-backed producers could not afford to do due to his international marquee value, they quietly paid off the injured crew member and assigned a personal handler to Kinski, essentially a studio enforcer whose sole job was to keep the actor from murdering anyone else for the duration of the shoot. But the toxicity on set was not limited to Kinski's explosive violence. The treatment of Vonetta McGee, who played the resilient widow Pauline, exposed the deeply entrenched racism of the European film industry. McGee, an incredibly talented Black American actress, was subjected to a relentless barrage of racial microaggressions and overt hostility from the Italian crew, who routinely referred to her using horrific slurs and dialect they assumed she would not understand. The makeup department intentionally neglected her, failing to provide adequate protection against the freezing elements, while white actors were coddled with heated tents and hot drinks. McGee refused to be a victim. In a move that was virtually unheard of for an African-American actress working in Europe at the time, she filed a formal complaint of racial discrimination with the Italian Actors Union, demanding safer working conditions and an end to the harassment. Her brave stand created a massive behind-the-scenes rift, with the producers terrified that the controversy would leak to the international press and destroy the film's distribution prospects. McGee's complaint was eventually settled with a public apology from the line producer, but the psychological scars of that shoot remained with her for years, adding a tragic layer of real-world cruelty to her on-screen portrayal of systemic oppression. This toxicity was tragically mirrored in the physical environment of the shoot itself. Principal photography took place in the Dolomites, a mountain range in northern Italy, during the absolute dead of winter. The production required tons of artificial snow, and the devastating choice made by the producers to save money would haunt the crew for decades. Rather than importing safe, modern, synthetic snow, Fida Cinematographica opted to use a mixture of crushed asbestos and highly reflective aluminum dust. The crew was ordered to spread this toxic mixture across the mountainous sets without any protective masks or respiratory gear. They were essentially working inside a cloud of carcinogenic fibers. The microscopic asbestos dust coated the actors' lungs, and the highly reflective aluminum powder caused severe optical damage. Cinematographer Silvano Iacovelli suffered immediate, agonizing snow blindness and permanent retinal damage due to the intense glare of the aluminum bouncing the sunlight directly into his camera and eyes. He lost a measurable percentage of his eyesight during the shoot, a fact he only revealed years later in an obscure Italian film journal. Furthermore, the long-term health consequences were catastrophic. Decades later, several crew members who spent weeks inhaling the artificial snow developed severe respiratory illnesses and mesothelioma, directly linking their cancers to Corbucci's frozen masterpiece. The studio buried these medical reports, and the asbestos scandal remains one of the darkest, most invisible legacies of spaghetti western production. Yet the human cost was not the only tragedy buried in the snow. The extreme, unforgiving cold of the Dolomites, where temperatures frequently plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, created an environment where survival was a daily struggle, not just for the crew, but for the animals brought in for the production. The film features several horses, and the decision to keep them on location in the freezing wilderness was a fatal one. Multiple horses suffered from severe hypothermia and frostbite during the prolonged shoot, with at least 2 animals collapsing and dying on set from the extreme conditions. In standard practice, a film production would face immediate shutdown and investigation by animal welfare organizations for such negligence. However, because the shoot was isolated in the mountains and heavily controlled by the studio's fixers, the deaths were completely covered up. The dead animals were quietly removed from the location under the cover of darkness and replaced with backup horses brought from a nearby village. No official reports were filed, and the crew was explicitly threatened with the loss of their final paychecks if they breathed the word to the press. The majestic, snow-covered landscapes that give the Great Silence its breathtaking visual poetry were literally a graveyard for the animals exploited to create them. But beneath the frozen surface lay a radically different film, one operating as a dense, furious political allegory. What the casual viewer sees as a story about bounty hunters and outlaws is actually a direct, scathing commentary on the socio-political chaos of Italy in 1968, a period known as the Hot Autumn. Corbucci and Donati structured the entire narrative as a Marxist critique of capitalist exploitation. The bounty hunters, led by Kinski's Loco, do not represent law enforcement. They represent predatory capitalism, killing impoverished workers for profit while hiding behind the legal framework of the state. The outlaws, on the other hand, are explicitly coded as displaced, starving laborers who steal out of absolute necessity, driven to the margins by a corrupt system. The character of Silence, a gun for hire who only fights for the oppressed, was written as an analog for a radicalized labor organizer. The snow itself functions as a metaphor for the crushing, indifferent weight of the state and the capitalist class, slowly freezing the working poor to death. Corbucci was secretly aligning himself with the far-left student and worker movements that were violently clashing with police in the streets of Rome and Milan, smuggling revolutionary propaganda into a highly commercial genre. This political subversion was only heightened by the film's grounding in very real, very dark American history. The script drew heavily from the actual winter of 1898 in Utah and Wyoming, a period historically documented as the Winter of the Dead, where destitute outlaws froze to death en masse while wealthy bounty hunters collected bounties on their frozen corpses. But the specific villainy of Loco was directly inspired by a real-life historical figure whose crimes were so grotesque they remain a stain on the American frontier. Corbucci based Loco's brutal, profit-driven methodology on the infamous bounty hunter Tom Horn, a man who essentially operated as a legalized assassin for wealthy cattle barons, murdering rustlers and innocent men alike without remorse. However, the script also pulled from an even darker, lesser-known figure named Portuguese Phil, a notorious killer who operated in the exact same snowbound territories. Phil was known for his sadistic penchant for mutilating the bodies of his bounties to ensure he could prove the kill and collect the cash. By weaving the historical reality of these state-sanctioned murderers into Loco's characterization, Corbucci was making a pointed statement about how the legal systems of the West were never designed to deliver justice, but rather to privatize violence for the benefit of the wealthy elite. This brings us to the audio landscape of the film, which was the site of its own behind-the-scenes battle. The iconic, haunting score was composed by Ennio Morricone, a frequent Corbucci collaborator. However, the score we hear in the final film is not the score Morricone originally intended. For The Great Silence, Morricone initially composed a deeply unsettling, atonal piece that heavily featured the unsettling wail of a human voice and discordant strings, designed to mirror the psychological breaking of the protagonist. When Morricone presented the score to the producers, they were horrified, arguing that it sounded like a horror film and would alienate the Western audience. The producers demanded a more traditional, melodic score, leading to a bitter screaming match between Morricone and the FIDA executives. Morricone felt profoundly insulted, viewing the demand as a fundamental misunderstanding of Corbucci's artistic vision. In a rare compromise, Morricone reorchestrated the main theme, incorporating the lilting, melancholic whistle that the film is now famous for. While this revised score is considered a masterpiece today, Morricone harbored resentment for decades, feeling he had been forced to dilute his most avant-garde work to satisfy the commercial anxieties of mob-backed producers. The immense pressure of fighting the producers, managing Kinski's terror, and defending his artistic vision took a catastrophic toll on Corbucci's physical and mental health. During the production, the director was secretly suffering from a severe, undiagnosed case of iritis, an agonizing inflammation of the iris that caused him excruciating pain and significantly blurred his vision. At the same time, he was navigating a brutal, deeply acrimonious divorce from his wife, who was demanding substantial alimony that he could not afford. Corbucci was effectively going blind and losing his family while stranded in a freezing mountain, trying to direct a nihilistic masterpiece. Crew members from the era recall finding Corbucci sitting alone in the snow, weeping from the pain in his eyes and the sheer despair of his personal life. He projected this profound, unyielding depression directly onto the film. The suffocating atmosphere of hopelessness that permeates every frame of The Great Silence was not merely a stylistic choice. It was the literal manifestation of a director who believed his life was collapsing around him. The film's bleakness is authentic because the man behind the camera had completely lost hope. But the real problem was that the film's unrelenting darkness was going to run straight into the buzzsaw of the Italian censorship board. In 1968, the Italian government maintained strict control over cinematic output, and films that depicted the total triumph of villainy and the failure of justice were routinely banned or heavily mutilated. Corbucci knew his planned ending, where silence is brutally gunned down by Loco, and the villains ride away victorious, would never survive the censors. This is exactly why he orchestrated one of the most brazen acts of deception in film history. Corbucci shot an entirely fake, traditional happy ending, where silence miraculously survives, draws his gun faster, and kills Loco in a standard duel. He submitted this altered cut to the Italian censorship board, securing the necessary theatrical certificate without any objections. However, once the film was approved and the prints were struck for international distribution, Corbucci quietly swapped the ending back to his original, nihilistic conclusion. The censors only realized they had been duped after the film premiered in Rome, but because the certification had already been granted, their hands were tied. It was a brilliant, subversive trick that allowed one of the most depressing endings in cinema history to slip past the authorities under the guise of generic entertainment. What makes this deception even more fascinating is that the downbeat ending we see today was actually Corbucci's second choice. The director's original, deeply sick vision for the climax was far more pyrotechnic and horrifying. In early storyboard drafts uncovered in a Roman archive years later, Corbucci planned to have the final shootout take place inside the wooden saloon, which Loco's men would set on fire. The ending was conceived as a grotesque inversion of the burning tavern climax in Django. Instead of the hero fighting his way out, silence was meant to be trapped inside the blazing building, slowly burning to death while the outlaws outside listened to his muffled screams. Corbucci wanted the audience to smell the burning flesh and witness the absolute helplessness of their hero. This concept was abandoned not for artistic reasons, but purely out of financial necessity. The production's budget was already ravaged by delays and Kinski's destructive behavior, and the Italian fire marshals refused to allow a large-scale interior burn on the remote mountain location without exorbitant insurance policies that FIDA simply refused to pay. Corbucci was forced to scale back his apocalyptic vision, settling for the cold-blooded execution in the snow, a decision that, ironically, made the ending feel even more clinical, realistic, and disturbing. The devastating impact of that final scene extended far beyond the narrative, deeply affecting the real people on set. The climax requires a group of local child extras to watch as Jean-Louis Trintignant's character is mercilessly gunned down by Klaus Kinski. To capture the genuine horror of the moment, Corbucci deliberately did not tell the children what was going to happen. They were positioned behind the camera, expecting a standard Western standoff. When Kinski suddenly drew his weapon and the squib rigs detonated, simulating Trintignant being shot multiple times in the head and chest. The children genuinely believed they were witnessing a murder. The blood-curdling, hysterical sobbing heard in the final film is not acting. It is the raw, unfiltered terror of children traumatized by what they just saw. A local Dolomite newspaper from the time ran a small, deeply buried article about how several of the child extras had to be sent home with local physicians after suffering panic attacks and crying fits that lasted for hours. Corbucci, ever the opportunist, recognized the power of their genuine terror and kept the cameras rolling, weaponizing the innocence of these children to hammer home his thesis that in a corrupt world, even the watchers are irreparably damaged by violence. However, when The Great Silence finally premiered, the critical establishment was utterly merciless. Tullio Kezich, one of Italy's most powerful and conservative critics, wrote a devastating review that eviscerated the film, labeling it a repugnant exercise in cruelty that offered no redemption, no moral center, and no entertainment value. Kezich argued that Corbucci had committed a sin against the cinema by removing the catharsis of the Western, replacing it with a suffocating blanket of Marxist despair. In the United States, the reception was even more catastrophic. American distributors were so terrified by the downbeat ending that they sat on the film for over a year before dumping it into drive-ins under the altered title, The Great Silence. American critics, conditioned by the moral clarity of John Ford and the escalating heroism of Leone, were baffled and disgusted by a film that rewarded the villain and murdered the hero. It grossed a fraction of its budget domestically and was quickly pulled from theaters, seemingly confirming every insulting thing the producers had said about Corbucci's Frozen Gamble. It was dismissed as a grim, bizarre anomaly, a film that had committed commercial and artistic suicide in equal measure. But the algorithm of history has vindicated The Great Silence, elevating it from a despised flop to one of the most important and influential westerns ever committed to celluloid. Contemporary film scholars and audiences, disillusioned by decades of cynical Hollywood sequels and sanitized violence, have rediscovered the film and recognized its shocking modernity, its refusal to provide comfort, its unflinching depiction of systemic failure, and its assertion that power always wins over righteousness resonate profoundly in a modern era, defined by institutional corruption and economic despair. Directors like Quentin Tarantino have aggressively championed the film, with Tarantino citing it as a primary influence on the bleak, revisionist tone of Django Unchained. Film historians now view Corbucci's decision to kill the hero not as a gimmick, but as a profound philosophical statement, a violent rejection of the fascistic undertones that had always lurked beneath the surface of the traditional Western. The Great Silence is no longer seen as a suicidal mistake. It is recognized as the ultimate deconstruction of the genre, a film that stared into the dark heart of the American myth and found only frozen corpses and unaccountable men. It stands as a bleak, beautiful testament to the power of cinema, to challenge, to provoke, and to refuse the easy lies we tell ourselves about justice. But let me know below, do you think The Great Silence's bleak ending is a brilliant subversion of cinematic expectations? Or is it a nihilistic act of audience punishment that ultimately offers no value? Does the film's Marxist allegory enhance its status as a masterpiece? Or does it reduce complex historical realities to heavy-handed political propaganda?